Russia warns of catastrophic consequences if Iran is attacked, offers to mediate between Tehran and Washington. In a recent interview with Russia's International Up File magazine, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov issued a strong warning that any attack on Iran's nuclear infrastructure could have catastrophic consequences for the entire Middle East region. His comments came after U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to bomb Iran if Tehran fails to reach a nuclear agreement with Washington. Ryabkov stated, "We hear these threats and ultimatums. We believe such methods are inappropriate and deserve criticism. It is simply an attempt by the U.S. to impose its will on Iran." The Russian diplomat affirmed that Moscow is ready to act as a mediator between Washington and Tehran to de-escalate tensions and encourage dialogue. "As long as the train hasn't left the station, we must double our efforts to achieve a reasonable agreement," he emphasized. Russia's position gains further significance as Moscow signed a strategic partnership treaty with Iran this past January, reinforcing the growing ties between the two nations. The warning from Moscow comes at a time when the Middle East is facing a heightened risk of renewed conflict. President Trump has not only threatened Iran with military action but also warned of increasing economic sanctions should Tehran refuse to make concessions. Observers fear that if the U.S. were to launch an actual strike on Iran, the region could spiral into a severe security crisis with unpredictable consequences.
Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant becomes a key issue in Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations. Currently, signs indicate that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, one of the 3 largest nuclear plants in the world, could become a focal point in the U.S.-initiated peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. When the conflict erupted in early 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin believed that Moscow would achieve victory within 3 days. However, the course of the war did not unfold as the Kremlin had expected. Nevertheless, in the initial weeks, Russia gained a crucial strategic advantage that may play a decisive role in upcoming peace negotiations. In early March 2022, Ukraine confirmed that Russian forces had taken control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest in Europe, located along the Dnipro River in central Ukraine. Although the plant has ceased electricity production for years, it still has the capacity to supply energy to approximately 4 million households. Zaporizhzhia at the center of U.S.-Russia peace talks. On the evening of March 16th, U.S. President Donald Trump confirmed that the nuclear power plant issue would be discussed in his upcoming meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin on March 18th. Speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, Trump stated, "We will discuss territorial matters, but we will also talk about nuclear power plants. This is an important issue." He emphasized that the U.S. has been in extensive discussions with both Ukraine and Russia regarding the allocation of certain strategic assets. Apart from Zaporizhzhia, Russia also controls another nuclear power plant in Kursk, where Ukraine launched a cross-border raid last year in an attempt to gain leverage in negotiations. However, Kyiv's bargaining power appears to be diminishing as Ukrainian forces have had to withdraw from the region under mounting Russian military pressure. Ukraine fears Russia's recommissioning of the nuclear power plant. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky believes that Russia is attempting to reactivate the Zaporizhzhia power plant. In a recent press conference, Zelensky stated, "Zaporizhzhia is a major issue for Russia, and they will keep bringing it up in negotiations. But in reality, the plant cannot function without Ukraine." He also accused Moscow of trying to reconnect the plant to its own power grid. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has repeatedly warned about the risk of losing control over Zaporizhzhia. Last year, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi cautioned that the situation at the plant posed significant dangers. The United Nations nuclear watchdog has documented drone strikes, power outages, and fires that have severely damaged one of the plant's 2 cooling towers. Russia controls 20% of Ukraine's territory, peace talks on the horizon. With Russia now controlling approximately 20% of Ukraine's territory, the upcoming negotiations are expected to center around control over nuclear power plants. Analysts suggest that this will be a key factor in shaping the conflict's trajectory in the coming months. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to push for an end to hostilities. Last week, Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal put forth by Washington, while Russia stated that further negotiations on specific terms are needed before making a final decision.
Ukraine and Finland launch International Civil Defense Alliance. On March 19th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Finnish President Alexander Stubb officially launched an international civil defense alliance, with Finland taking the lead role. According to United 24 media, the initiative aims to strengthen Ukraine's civil defense infrastructure amid ongoing security challenges. As part of the initiative, both sides signed a cooperation agreement to build safe shelters across Ukraine and expand collaboration with European and global partners. Speaking at a joint press conference, President Zelensky emphasized Finland's experience in civil protection and noted that the alliance would mobilize international resources to implement practical shelter projects. "Our countries understand the risks of being neighbors with Russia," said Zelensky. "Finland has a long-standing tradition of effective civil defense, and today we discussed ways to expand this expertise." President Stubb reaffirmed Finland's strong support for Ukraine, stating, "We stand with Ukraine and will continue to do so as long as needed." This civil defense alliance is considered a major step in protecting Ukrainian civilians from ongoing Russian attacks. According to the Kyiv Independent, further details about the alliance will be released in the coming days, although the total funding allocated for shelter construction has not yet been disclosed. President Zelensky's official visit to Finland began on March 18th, during which he met with senior leaders and representatives from the defense industry to discuss military cooperation, EU integration, and sanctions against Russia. Although Russia previously agreed to a 30-day pause in attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, President Zelensky stated that Russian forces continued to strike civilian facilities on the night of March 18th. "This is why air defense support is crucial," he said, "and pressure on Russia must continue to ensure the safety of our people." Earlier, on February 26th, Finland announced a military aid package worth $660 million, approximately $691 million, for Ukraine. More recently, on the March 13th, during a meeting with Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, Finnish Defense Minister Antti Häkkänen unveiled Finland's 28th military aid package, valued at approximately $200 million. Both ministers also signed a memorandum of understanding to boost bilateral defense cooperation.
Chinese expert: Ukraine's push into Kursk was a strategic mistake by the US in Ukraine. Recently, Lu Wang, an expert on this affairs at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, stated that Ukraine's military advancement into Russia's Kursk region could be considered the greatest strategic error made by both the US and Ukraine. In an interview with RIA Novosti, Lu Wang argued that after Ukraine's spring 2023 offensive failed to achieve its intended goals, Russia successfully met key objectives in its military campaign and gained leverage for engaging in strategic negotiations with the United States. Ukraine's deployment of troops into Kursk in 2024 could be seen as the biggest strategic miscalculation by the US and Ukraine, as it gave Russia an even stronger justification to expand its offensive against Ukraine, Lu Wang remarked. In the early morning of August 6, 2024, Ukrainian armed forces launched an offensive to gain control over territory in Russia's Kursk region. However, the attack was repelled by Russian forces. Chief of the Russian General Staff, General Valery Gerasimov, announced that the operation in Kursk would conclude with the complete defeat of the enemy and a push back to the national border. On February 19, 2025, Russian President Vladimir Putin reported that troops from the 810th Brigade, currently fighting in the Kursk region, had crossed the Russian border and entered Ukrainian territory. Russian forces are currently advancing along the entire front line in Kursk as well as the Borovsk and Bryansk regions. An anti-terrorist operation mode has been implemented to ensure security in the area. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, between March 8th and March 14th, Russian forces liberated 30 settlements in the Kursk region, including the regional center of Xgia. During this decisive offensive, Ukrainian forces are believed to have suffered more than 2,000 casualties, marking a significant Russian advance in reclaiming control of the border area.
US and Russia nearing ceasefire agreement. Is Europe living in a parallel universe? According to Russian news agency RIA Novosti on March 21st, U.S. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce stated that the U.S. and Russia are just one step away from reaching a full ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. "We are just one breath away from a complete ceasefire," Bruce told Nuneon. "At that point, we can begin to talk not just about peace lasting a week or 6 months, but about lasting peace." On the Russian side, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova confirmed that the Russian delegation will participate in consultations with the U.S., scheduled to take place on March 24th in Riyadh. The delegation will be led by Senator Grigory Kassin, chairman of the Federation Council's International Affairs Committee, and FSB advisor Sergei Bada. Russian presidential spokesperson Yuri Usop also announced that the discussions would include the Black Sea Initiative. In recent weeks, both Washington and Moscow have shown increased determination to move toward a long-term peaceful resolution of the Ukraine conflict. However, according to an analysis by the American magazine The National Interest, Europe is seen as living in a parallel universe. Analysts from the publication argue that recent shifts in the Russia-Ukraine relationship have opened the door to constructive negotiations with President Putin. Meanwhile, European leaders are perceived as lacking strategic foresight and continue to rely on unrealistic proposals, such as deploying NATO forces as peacekeepers in Ukraine, something Russia has categorically refused to accept in any peace agreement. Talks about forming a voluntary coalition are also seen as potentially derailing negotiations with Moscow. According to experts, Europe's political elite has lost touch with pragmatic, non-ideological approaches to security. In contrast, Russia is seen as pursuing a clear strategy backed by considerable military strength. Nevertheless, Europe continues to advocate for rapid militarization and the creation of an alliance to support Ukraine, even at the risk of escalating tensions and prolonging the conflict.
U.S. and Ukraine discuss energy takeover. Russia strongly opposes. On March the 19th, U.S. President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a phone call to discuss the possibility of the U.S. taking over Ukraine's energy infrastructure, including the operation of nuclear power plants. On March the 22nd, U.S. Energy Secretary Tris stated that Washington has no issue with operating energy facilities in Ukraine. In response, Yuri Chenischuk, director of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, declared, "I can say one thing, no one will have the right to control our plant, no matter how much they want it." He emphasized that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant belongs to Russia and will be operated in accordance with Russian law. The Zaporizhzhia plant, the largest in Europe, has been under Russian control since March 2022. The Zaporizhzhia region also held a referendum and voted to join Russian territory later that year. Since mid-2023, the plant has largely ceased operations due to the threat of shelling, drone attacks, UAV, and disrupted water supply. Both Moscow and Kyiv have repeatedly accused each other of attacks that endanger the safety of the facility. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, has maintained a monitoring mission at the plant since September 2022. In early March, President Zelensky stated that the Zaporizhzhia plant cannot function without Kyiv's oversight. He stressed that Ukraine needs funding and technical experts to restore operations. The plant is currently managed by a subsidiary of Russia's state nuclear energy corporation, Rosatom. In December 2024, the plant CEO announced plans to restart operations once security conditions are fully ensured.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump: Ukraine may not survive even with continued aid. In an interview with Fox News broadcast on March 9th, former U.S. President Donald Trump declared that Ukraine might not survive the war with Russia, even if it continues to receive aid from Washington. Ukraine may not survive despite aid. When asked about the possibility of the U.S. stopping military aid to Ukraine, Trump stated that even with continued support, Ukraine would still struggle to survive. He remarked that this conflict should not have happened, but it ultimately did, dragging the U.S. into a mess. Additionally, the former U.S. president criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, claiming that he received aid from the U.S. too easily, like taking candy from a baby, under the administration of former President Joe Biden. Trump stated that the U.S. had provided $350 billion in aid to Ukraine, but received nothing in return from Kyiv. Mineral agreement and U.S. demands for Ukraine. During the interview, when asked whether he expected Ukraine to sign a rare earth minerals agreement with the U.S., Trump responded, "Yes, I think it will happen." He also affirmed that he had checked and confirmed that Ukraine possesses significant rare earth mineral resources. However, according to NBC News, U.S. officials revealed that a mineral agreement alone would not be sufficient for Washington to resume military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Trump is reportedly seeking a change in Ukraine's stance on peace negotiations, including a willingness to cede territory to Russia. Furthermore, the former U.S. president also wants Ukraine to hold elections, even hinting at the possibility that President Zelensky may have to step down. Tensions in U.S.-Ukraine relations. According to sources from late February, Trump and Zelensky had a heated argument at the White House. Trump, along with Vice President James David, criticized Ukraine's lack of respect and gratitude toward the U.S. Following the tense exchange, Washington suspended military aid and halted intelligence sharing with Kyiv. On March 11th, the U.S. is expected to hold talks in Saudi Arabia to discuss peace efforts between Russia and Ukraine, as well as a potential mineral cooperation agreement between Washington and Kyiv. Ukraine has no cards to play, while Moscow holds all the advantages. In the interview, former President Trump emphasized that working with Ukraine is harder than working with Russia, as Kyiv has no leverage, while Moscow holds all the advantages. He warned that the U.S. could cut off all support for Ukraine unless Kyiv proves its commitment to achieving peace with Moscow.
U.S. and Europe discuss security guarantees for Ukraine outside NATO. In a recent interview with American journalist Tower Cannon, U.S. Presidential envoy to the Middle East Stephen Wav revealed that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak have acknowledged that Ukraine cannot join NATO in the near future. However, Wav emphasized that the United States and European countries continue to hold discussions on providing Ukraine with security guarantees based on principles similar to NATO's Article 5, which ensures collective defense. Wav noted that talks have been underway about whether Ukraine can receive such collective defense protections from the U.S. and Europe without becoming a full NATO member. "I believe it's still possible," he said. Earlier this month, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni also proposed extending NATO's Article 5 protection to Ukraine without requiring its formal accession to the alliance. According to Meloni, this approach would offer long-term and effective security for Ukraine, more so than other options, including deploying peacekeeping forces to monitor ceasefire agreements. She stressed that sending military forces to Ukraine, whether from the UK or other nations, would be a complex and potentially less effective solution. Security guarantees are currently one of Ukraine's key conditions before any peace agreement with Russia can be reached. Meanwhile, Czech President Petr Pavel also highlighted the importance of security assurances for Ukraine. He stated that such guarantees should consist of two parts: a strategic agreement between Washington and Kyiv, and concrete commitments from European countries that have pledged to support Ukraine. President Pavel explained that due to the presence of American businesses in Ukraine, Washington would have a vested interest in protecting its assets there. He added that current discussions are focusing on forming a new alliance of willing countries, those capable and ready to deploy stabilization forces to Ukraine after a peace deal is reached between Kyiv and Moscow.
Russia claims to have shot down 337 Ukrainian UAVs in largest-scale attack. On the night of March 10th to the early hours of March 11th, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that its air defense forces had shot down 337 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, across multiple regions. This is considered the largest UAV attack on Russian territory since the beginning of the year. According to statistics from the Russian Ministry of Defense, among the UAVs shot down, 91 fell in the Moscow region, 126 in the Kursk region, 38 in the Bryansk region, 22 in the Ryazan region, 10 in the Kaluga region, 8 in the Lipetsk region, 8 in the Oryol region, 6 in the Voronezh region, and 3 in the Nizhny Novgorod region. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin confirmed that this was an unprecedented UAV attack targeting the capital. Meanwhile, Moscow Region Governor Andrei Vorobyov reported that the UAV attacks caused casualties in 3 cities, including 1 fatality in the Domodedovo area and a total of 14 injuries, including an 8-year-old child. Previously, Ukraine claimed that long-range, low-cost kamikaze UAVs were highly effective in deep strikes against Russian territory. Meanwhile, Moscow accused Ukraine of using terrorist tactics due to battlefield failures. The Russian Investigative Committee described the latest UAV attack as an act of terrorism. Russia considers UAVs one of Ukraine's primary weapons, alongside modern weaponry supplied by the West. However, the U.S. and its allies continue to prohibit Kyiv from using Western-supplied weapons for long-range attacks inside Russia. As a result, Ukraine is seeking to develop domestic UAVs for such strikes. At the same time, on the night of March 10th, local time, Ukrainian authorities reported that Russia launched airstrikes on Kiev at midnight using drones and ballistic missiles. According to reports from Ukrainian officials, the country's air defense systems shot down 79 Russian UAVs. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko stated on Telegram that air defense forces were working to secure the capital's skies. Reuters reporters noted that multiple explosions were heard in Kyiv and surrounding areas, likely the sounds of Ukraine's air defense systems in operation. Russia intensifies integration of occupied Ukrainian territories. As the world closely watches Russia's next move regarding the temporary ceasefire agreement with Ukraine proposed by the United States, questions remain about whether true peace can be achieved between the two nations. However, one undeniable fact is that even if the fighting temporarily subsides, the Ukrainian territories under Russian control are gradually being integrated into Moscow's administrative, passport, and education systems. Increased administrative control in occupied Ukrainian territories. According to France 24 on March 13th, Moscow's control over eastern Ukrainian territories has become increasingly systematic. Officials from Helping to Leave, an organization assisting Ukrainian citizens in evacuating occupied areas, reported that Russian checkpoints have become common at city entrances, rural regions, and major roadways. These checkpoints allow Russian forces to regulate access to different areas and scrutinize the identification documents of civilians. For those attempting to leave Russian-occupied territories for Ukrainian-controlled regions, the journey involves first passing through Russia and Belarus before reaching Ukraine's northwestern border. Border inspections at Russian checkpoints can take hours or even days. Russian border guards reportedly pay special attention to young Ukrainian men, most of whom have already been issued Russian passports and risk being conscripted into the Russian military. We can never guarantee that Russian border guards won't detain them. It's like a lottery, said Sofia, a representative from Helping to Leave. Last week, the Kremlin announced that it had issued 3.5 million Russian passports to Ukrainian citizens in the occupied regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, 4 territories Moscow declared annexed in September 2022. President Vladimir Putin confirmed that the passportization process in eastern Ukraine is largely complete, solidifying Russia's control over these areas. Forced integration and population resettlement. In occupied Ukrainian territories, those without Russian passports are classified as foreign nationals, stripping them of property ownership rights, pension benefits, and access to health care and social welfare. The Russian government has also been using humanitarian aid as a means to encourage people to accept Russian citizenship. This includes financial assistance for relocation to Russia, subsidies for families with newborns registered as Russian citizens, and other economic incentives. According to researcher Jaroslava Papieri from PB Ham University in the UK, children in Russian-occupied schools are required to follow the Russian education curriculum. The Ukrainian language, literature, and history have been completely replaced with Russian language, Russian literature, and Russian history. Any mention of Ukraine has been removed from textbooks introduced by Moscow, Papieri stated. While some parents continue to educate their children online following Ukraine's national curriculum, such actions must be done discreetly. Anything perceived as support for Ukraine has become dangerous. Even speaking Ukrainian in public could lead to arrest, Sofia warned. Strengthened Russian control and territorial consolidation. The Russian government has announced plans to build 25 new prisons and 6 detention centers in occupied Ukrainian territories by 2026. Additionally, Moscow is pushing forward with a resettlement program to bring Russian citizens into these regions. New legislation permits the confiscation of abandoned properties, while financial aid is provided to Russian citizens seeking to purchase homes in these territories. As of March 2024, at least 1,785 apartments and businesses in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia have been seized. The tightening of control over all aspects of life in occupied territories indicates that Russia is gradually incorporating these areas into its administrative system. Analyst Papieri commented, although President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine will never recognize any occupied territory as part of Russia, the longer these regions remain under Russian control, the harder it will be to reclaim them.